So that brings me specifically to the issues around Grenfell Tower. There is a building regulation B4, that covers external fire spread. And essentially the regulation is worded as simply as the external face of a building shall not extend fire up the face of it. Then there are some more detailed requirements, and the first thing that any building inspector would normally ask is your external cladding combustible or non-combustible? Okay, what is the surface spread of flame rating for it? There are two key requirements, 12.6, which is external surface, and 12.7, which is insulation. What we saw at Grenfell is a failure to have complied with those regulations. Is it a problem that we already knew about? The answer to that is yes, we've known about this for some time. The research certainly goes back to the 1960s, and the rules have been the same pretty much since the 1960s. In the 1990s, we started to see buildings overclad for the first time, and in particular, Knowsley Height in Liverpool resulted in people being aware of the risk of fire spread in the cavity of the cladding itself. So it is something that has happened on a number of occasions, but we've not seen the number of deaths or fire spread in the way in which we did at Grenfell Tower. That is something that is completely different, it's completely unique, and it's not something to say that we've ever seen in this country before. The problem is that you can have fire spreading up a building and then breaking back into the building itself, as you see in this diagram. There are a series of things that we've assumed since the 1960s that we've managed to bring into the building that have prevented that getting into the staircases and down and allowed people to get out. In fact, in the vast majority of cases, fires would be contained in the individual apartment in which the fire first started. In the occasions when it's been necessary to evacuate buildings, generally speaking, it's been 2 or 3 flats only that have been necessary to evacuate, not the whole building, which is why they're designed with a single staircase, with a stay-in-place policy, and why the fire service make a decision on who to evacuate when they first arrive. The government were given a series of recommendations on the back of the Lakanal House fire. At that time, they were told to rewrite the approved document B because the guidance was frankly nigh on impossible to follow for anyone who isn't an expert in the field. As an expert in the field, I can certainly turn around and say it is very difficult to follow the guidance and to understand precisely what it is that you do need to do and what you don't need to do. In short, for buildings of that type, you either have to have non-combustible products or you need to have the product tested. One of the things about the way in which the regulations are currently written is that they're written in a functional form. They're not prescriptive. It doesn't say that you have to do something in particular. It essentially says the fire shan't spread on the outside of the building. As a result of that, you don't have to follow the guidance that's contained in the things called the approved documents. As a result of that, the Building Control Alliance and the fact that the government hadn't updated the guidance produced their own guide in 2014, which started to change the rules. Okay, it started to change the way in which we interpreted it. And what they said was that because we've had a number of these tests done, what we can do is we can take a look at those tests and we can compare one test with another, and we can say that you don't need to test a differing layout. You can base your decisions on the previous tests that have been carried out. They're very expensive to carry out these tests, so from the manufacturer there is huge pressure to enable them to use their insulation product with a competitor's cladding product so that you can mix and match as much as possible. Then after that, the NHBC then decided to introduce further guidance which said from their perspective they've seen enough of these reports now that essentially they would permit a lower level of cladding with a lower level of insulation because they'd seen so many examples of where these things had passed. And there's the NHBC guidance. What effectively is happening is you're having organisations that are fire engineers looking at the results and saying that test passed with that particular cladding, it passed, and a separate test passed with this particular type of insulation, therefore we can take the insulation from that test, the cladding from that test, put them together and they will work fine. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. And DCLG have said it's never been the intention of the guidance for that to happen. It should be that the products are non-combustible, or to use their more correct term, a material of limited combustibility. And that if you don't do that, then the whole unit should be tested as one. So what they're doing is they're currently in the process of testing a number of combinations of different types of insulation with different types of cladding panels. If you follow my Twitter feed, you'll have seen me publish these over the course of the past few weeks. There are around 230 buildings so far that have been identified with claddings that fail. The first 4 types that you'll see on the screen have failed. They are typically buildings that have a cladding, the aluminium cladding, with a combustible core. Okay, so they're non-fire rated panels. Then you have a combination of aluminium cladding with a fire rated core to it, but a combustible insulation. Some of those have passed, some of those have failed. What you then have is a non-combustible outside cladding and a non-combustible insulation. So far we've only tested one of those, and that has passed quite easily, and the anticipation is the 7th test, when it's published, will also show that the combination of a fully non-combustible system will pass the tests. So what does this mean to people? It means there are 230 or so buildings out there that need to have their cladding looked at, and quite possibly have the cladding taken off, or the insulation taken off, or both taken off, and they will need to be reclad. This is a major exercise for all of the owners of these buildings, many of which are social housing providers, but it's not just social housing, it's also commercial buildings as well. The recladding of these buildings is a major project in itself. It's going to cost several £1,000,000 in each occasion to put scaffolding up, to take the cladding off, and to put new cladding back on. Additionally, one of the problems that you've got is that the less combustible insulation is actually thicker than the combustible insulation, which means you're going to start changing the outside of the building, and it won't be as simple as just changing one for another. Additionally, on top of that, the weight of the materials are different. So the structural ability of the frames themselves to support the loads of these claddings will need to be looked at. In short, all 230 or so buildings will need to have new building control approvals on them for the recladding work. And it's important that whoever carries out those inspections and approves those work understand what it is that they're actually looking at, and make sure that the cavity barrier is going correctly, that the building isn't likely to leak as a result of it, that the cladding itself is the correct type and is installed correctly in accordance with the current guidance. I've been Geoff Wilkinson. I'm sure there will be some questions that you'll have for me. Thank you very much.